Okay. Saad Soliman is the founder and CEO of Soliman Consulting Incorporated. He's a subject matter expert in the specialization of reentering citizens, aka offender reentry. Mr. Soliman has over 20 years of experience in the field and has a unique and intimate understanding of the criminal justice system, including typical obstacles and ways to overcome them. Mr. Soliman has worked in various capacities with high-risk youth, adjudicated youth, and directly with reentering citizens through a variety of organizations. Today, Mr. Soliman will share his knowledge and experience in a presentation entitled Try Problems, Try Solutions, a logistical and thorough analysis of the complexities of reentry. Please join me to welcome Mr. Saad Soliman.
Hello. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the logistics of reentry. Ms. Webb, when she was asking what the connection is between public safety and recidivism, it's actually a striking connection in that every time an ex-offender coming home recidivates, public safety decreases. There's an inverse relationship between one and the other. How so? Today my presentation will explain exactly how so. What we have in our country is a situation in which about 25% of the population is currently incarcerated. With regards to these statistics, we have some startling facts. 1 in 99 Americans is incarcerated or will be. 1 in 32 Latino Americans is incarcerated or will be. What's shocking is that 1 in 15 African Americans is incarcerated or will be. With a show of hands, how many people here know someone who went to jail or know someone that is in jail right now? That's an epidemic in our society, and our youth are growing up in a society in which incarceration is commonplace. In America, right now, we are spending $68 billion annually on corrections. $68 billion. Corrections budgets at a national level increase on an average of 15% per year. Let's take a look at the system real quick. We have arrest, sentencing, serving time or the incarceration period, the pre-release period leading up to the individual coming home, and then specifically we have reentry. And after reentry, we have post-release. The process is unique in that individuals, when we have a quote-unquote active audience, jail, these individuals aren't being given the kind of training in order for them to be marketable and have the kind of employment marketability and release. And they're re-entering a society that's very complex with regards to now we're in a more performance-based economy opposed to the traditional systems-based economy. And let me explain that. We had an era in our country in which pensions, Social Security, and the retirement from an individual company would maintain a pretty decent lifestyle in this country. But what's occurring is now that companies are finding, in order to cut costs, they're going more towards contractors and subcontractors so that they can eliminate the benefits and cut their bottom line a little bit more. And so what's the impact, what's the ramification on individuals coming from prison? Types of sentences, and this is something that I really want everybody to listen up about. We have punitive sentences in our country. A punitive sentence, an example of a punitive sentence is the death penalty. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. These sentences do not leave room for the possibility of rehabilitation. An individual sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole is assumed to be one that is non-redeemable. An individual that's given the death penalty is not given a sentence that allows for rehabilitation. A common question coming up in policymakers and lawmakers down in DC now, they're saying, well look, we have to ask the question. Individuals that are being given these sentences, do they deserve an opportunity to come home? And if we are going to give them rehabilitative sentences, then Have these individuals been habilitated into our society to begin with? Because what's occurring is that law enforcement and the criminal justice system now is finding that these individuals are used to societal norms that are antisocial, as opposed to the pro-social norms that we were raised on and were taught. Rehabilitative sentencing includes diversion programs, education, rehabilitation, drug treatment, and shorter prison terms. You've heard the phrase about boot camps, you've heard the phrase about minimum mandatory sentencing. These are all rehabilitative sentences that are aimed more at giving individuals an opportunity at reentering, and in that reentering process, they're given a lot of resources offered by the Department of Labor, by various probation and parole entities, along with the prison systems and their respective community organizations. The complexities. Now here we get into more than 97% of incarcerated individuals will return to society at some point. So it behooves us as a society, both from the economic standpoint, along with the actual societal standpoint, to address this issue. Because we're not dealing with individuals where we're locking them up and throwing away the key. The war on drugs in the 80s incarcerated a mass amount of people. And the laws have been changed because we find that there's collateral consequences. These collateral consequences can be something as simple as a man convicted of a drug offense cannot come home and reside with his child's mother in subsidized housing. Section 8 housing will not permit a felon to live on the premises. And so there's some that would argue that that's a systematic breaking up of the family unit. In that regard, we have what they call collateral consequences that need to be addressed from a policy-making standpoint. 87% of those at high risk of recidivating, whether through new offense or parole revocation within 3 years of their release, are returned to prison. 87%. The issue is, on a taxpayer perspective, we're talking about anywhere from $11,700 per year to incarcerate these individuals, all the way up to $68,000, and that is in Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken. That's a very high cost. If we were to look at the amount of money that they could be making and paying into the system versus the amount of money that they're pulling from the system, economically, just from a dollars and cents standpoint, it makes sense for us to look at these laws and look at the punitive aspect of what we're doing to these communities. Corrections budgets have been increasing exponentially the past 15 years. You've heard a term, overcrowding. That is common amongst the corrections community. And the reason why is because when you put people in for various periods of time, it builds, that population builds. We went from a population of about 740,000 in 1982 to 2.5 million in 2012. Exponentially, we're finding ourselves in a situation where we can't keep up the rate of incarceration. On CBS, there was actually a spot on the Sunday News Hour a few weeks ago, and it was talking about, the title of the piece was called Incarceration Nation. Europe and policymakers in Europe are actually looking at our nation and saying, are we a nation of incarceration? So now, I'd like to engage the audience in a case study. Here we have, the question is this: what should the sentence be? You guys ready to engage with me on this? You guys ready? All right. We have a 17-year-old male who commits manslaughter during a botched robbery. Statistically, 96% of individuals have been incarcerated during these years, that have been incarcerated during these years and released, reoffend within 18 months of release. He's sentenced to 15 years in prison. Is that a fair sentence or no? Is it a fair sentence? I'm asking. Individuals sentenced to 15 years in prison typically return to prison within 18 months. What are the alternatives to sentencing that individual? Does anyone know? Does anyone think about what the alternatives would be with regards to giving this individual youth a sentence? other than prison? What are the options?
Probation.
Probation for manslaughter?
Maybe you could go to a mental institution.
Okay, you can go to a mental institution. Do you believe that an individual teen that's 17 years old that commits manslaughter during a botched robbery is redeemable? Just off of the facts that I've provided on the screen. And anyone can chime in on this too.
Yes, he's redeemable.
He is redeemable.
Yes.
Why?
Well, manslaughter is during felony is not an intentional crime.
It's an accident.
It's an accident.
Correct.
The fact that this kid was a robber will not be denied. He's not a murderer. He's only convicted of manslaughter. And by definition, it was a crime committed during a murder during a death caused during a felony.
Correct. Very correct.
Actually, at 17 years old, lots of us have made many mistakes. Maybe not during felonies, but they might have.
No, that's a compelling point. Because the reality of the situation is that manslaughter is any killing committed during the commission of a felony that is accidental. And that's what they call a mitigating circumstance. Aggravating circumstances are, say, for example, we're in the middle of a robbery. Thank you. We're in the middle of a robbery, and you see someone coming across the parking lot that could prevent the robbery from occurring, and you shoot that individual intentionally. That's a murder. That's an aggravating circumstance to first-degree premeditated murder. Whereas in a botched robbery, we have a robbery that's gone wrong. And what happens in a robbery gone wrong is accidental. But because it's predicated upon the fact that it's committed during the commission of a felony, it then becomes a crime.
You're saying that after 18 months of release, it's likely to happen again and end up back in jail, then how is that a mistake? Don't do it again.
I'm not saying that it's likely to happen again. Actually, the statistics on situations like this are startling. There's actually a 12% likelihood that a crime similar to this is ever recommitted. But it's because of the individual coming in at 17 years old and transitioning home after 15 years at 32 years old that they find themselves unable to adjust to societal norms. And so they find themselves meeting dead ends every time they turn, and then they commit a similar or different kind of crime. And that's where the statistic of 96% of individuals having been incarcerated during these specific years, these developmental years, recommit within 18 months of release. So it's not that we're expecting that this individual will come home and kill someone else, but we're expecting that this individual statistically will come home and find himself in a situation or herself in a situation where they have zero options. If you go to a job, any college student, any college graduate going to a position, applying, their resume includes what? What they've done since they've been in school, all these things that they've been able to accomplish while they're in school, and they still have a hard shot competing against seasoned professionals that have already been in the field and have experience, and in this kind of economy will settle for a lower salary. And so in that regard, you find an individual in a position that's extremely disadvantageous for them in that they have a felony on their record, they have very little marketability skills, these individuals typically have very little college education, and they come home competing with college grads and seasoned professionals with experience in the field. Therein lies the 96% statistic, because they find themselves enveloped by all of these challenges, and they're really not that well equipped to deal with these challenges.
And presumably the other question we need to ask, what other information we need is a comparable 17-year-old male committing manslaughter during a botched robbery. We want to be able to compare that to somebody who, instead of being sentenced to 15 years, is sentenced to a lesser sentence in a rehabilitative context. And then what is that person's recidivism rate? Do we have reliable figures that compare apples to apples in that regard?
In that regard, we do. And it's interesting that you ask that, because specifically, and these statistics are very borough-specific. Municipalities, townships, states, they all have their individual information with regards to this, because the sentencing guidelines range from state to state. In Delaware, in which the state that I'm from, I'm looking at this case study, and I'm saying, well, what's the typical sentence for an individual such as this? The typical sentence is anywhere from 30 months, which is 2.5 years, all the way up to life in prison. And so there's really no range that we can base any kind of specific example information to say apples to apples. And the reason why is that when the judiciary encounters a case, what they end up doing is they go by every case on a case-to-case basis, because now we have to consider what was this individual's criminal history? What was his predisposition to crime prior to this case? Because you don't just go from high school, Christmas vacation, to a robbery with a botched robbery that ends up killing, because a botched robbery implies a weapon. And so now we're talking about the complexities of the judicial system. And so what happens is that we find that there's no real way to enumerate the amount of statistics into one baseline number. The median at this point is a little bit less and a little bit more in most cases, you know, in terms of the aggravating circumstances and the mitigating circumstances. But to do that, we would have to go in a little bit deeper. And so I think it's going to be very interesting when we talk about the next step. Defying the odds and creating new realities. I think it would be absolutely shocking to the audience today to realize that the case study that we were talking about is me. I went to prison at 17 years old for 15 years in prison. And now I work for the Department of Justice as a subject matter expert for the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Delaware. I served 15 years in prison, from the years where I was 17 to the years that I was 32. And so the question then becomes, how did you do it? How did you defy the odds? How did you come home and become the individual that you've become? And let me tell you, the reason why you guys are in class is because education is the real equalizer in our society. It's the only equalizer in our society. So getting an associate's degree in computer science wasn't enough. Getting a bachelor's degree in business management wasn't enough. Getting a master's degree in criminal justice with an emphasis on social service wasn't enough. Enrolling in the doctoral program at NYU still isn't enough for me. And so I find myself in a situation where I'm constantly presenting the options. What could be possible? Are we locking up the door, or throwing away the key and locking individuals up and saying that redeemability is an abstract concept that we can't accomplish because individuals had previously not been habilitated in order to be rehabilitated? The question that I have for everyone here today is, are we premature in that assumption? Are we incorrect in that assumption? In that, an individual that emerged from my situation should be in prison within 18 months of their release because of the fact that our society is based in a way in which opportunities for those who have committed mistakes are not presented. Is that fair? And if it's not fair, then how are we going to, as the future policymakers and lawmakers of our society, how are we going to focus on this issue from a more humane perspective? The reality of the situation is, I was not prepared for the world that I re-entered because it wasn't the world that I remembered. You think about what happened from the period of 1995 to the period of 2010. We had the internet boom. Before, when I got locked up, if someone was talking about the internet, they'd say, let me call you back, I'm on the internet. Remember those days, dial-up? And you remember the times when a cell phone was this big clunky thing that was larger than this? You guys probably don't, but we all do. The reality of the situation is that the world was dramatically different. And in this world in which multimedia is so pervasive that on every level you can find out what's happening almost in real time, where exactly do you gain the tools necessary for this? Because most corrections institutions, due to budget constraints and the security challenges surrounding institutions, they don't have the upgrades. They're very antiquated. They don't have the kind of computers that we take for granted. They don't have the kind of accessibility to email that we find commonplace. They don't go into a classroom and find modules with laptops. These individuals are typically utilizing GED books that are from 1990, 1994. And that's because of the budget restraints that are occurring. What's happening is individuals are coming home and they're ill-equipped to deal with a much more competitive society, and they're falling. And who's footing the bill to this fall? We are. Collectively as a society, we are. Where could that $68 billion be better spent? Could it be better spent in education? Could it be better spent in providing opportunities for students coming out of high school that can't afford college? Could it be better spent in ways that expand the mind, similar to what Public Mind Poll is doing? I was released from prison on March 23rd, 2010, after having served a 15-year sentence for the aforementioned crime. Upon release, I reemerged to a world that was completely different, and I was prepared to re-enter the world that I'd left. But I wasn't prepared to re-enter the world that I encountered. And that was something that I found extremely vexing, in that, with all the education that I'd amassed, I still was not able to navigate properly with full function at a high level, and that high level is what I demanded of myself. Since then, I've been able to assimilate into society at a very high functioning level, and to that extent, I now stand before you. And you guys gotta wonder, like, well, what did Professor Sachs do? How did she find this dude? Well, the reality of the situation is I am now one of the pioneers of a reentry court program in Delaware, a federal reentry court program in which we take ex-offenders that are coming home from prison that are deemed to be high risk, and that's from a criminogenic assessment score, and we provide them with resources, added resources. If you don't know how to find a job, we'll teach you, we'll train you, we'll empower you. Because a lot of times what's been happening with regards to the criminal justice system and corrections, community corrections nationally, is that we've been leaning towards policies that enable. Policies that enable are similar to partnerships struck between a federal probationary entity, and that probationary entity having a partnership with small business, saying, you own a business, I'll reduce your recidivism, I'll reduce your overhead and your turnover by having referrals for individuals that'll take advantage of the opportunity to work. Well, you take these individuals and you put them in these jobs. What's going to happen with these individuals if they lose the job? They're going to come right back to probation and ask for another job because they didn't seek out the opportunity. They didn't know how to seek out the opportunity. So what we're doing is we're creating a platform in which these individuals can actually gain the skills, motivational interviewing, resume building, learning how to engage people, because oftentimes a lot of these individuals are very antisocial, and we're basically enabling these individuals in a way that provides empowerment. And that empowerment comes in the form of pro-social norms and societal norms that we all hold to be very normal. So now, what's our responsibility as a society? Where do we go from here? And is policy reform enough? The question is, as a society, and from a societal standpoint, what exactly is our responsibility to the youth of these families? I'm not talking about the offenders. We're talking about breaking the cycle. Because a season comes and goes, a cycle is endless. And with a father and a mother that don't raise their youth, their children, in proper guidance and tutelage, that individual, that youth is at risk 8 times more likely to commit a crime than an individual youth that didn't have parents that committed crimes. So what's our responsibility to these individuals? Do we have a responsibility to these individuals, or do we take the stance, eye for an eye, and let these individuals take the punishment that they've earned? The recompense for a crime is prison. If we take that individual parent away from the youth that they're raising, does that present an option for that youth to then become a burden on society as well by committing crimes later on? That's a question that's being raised all over the country. In every policy room, in every legislative hall, whether it's DC or it's small townships or boroughs of Madison, we're all focusing on how to reduce not only the cyclical deterioration of the inner city communities and the communities that are plagued by crime, but how to make our world safer. For it is true that every individual that recidivates, again, reduces public safety by an inch. And if we continue to have inches gone, how many feet will we lose? Now I think we're going to open the floor to a Q&A.
Thank you, Mr. Soliman, for your presentation. We're going to head to a question and answer session, so if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll give you the mic.
Thank you, Mr. Soliman. My question is to you. I'm listening to everything you're saying, and you're asking, is somebody who goes through the criminal justice system, who is subject to these type of punitive reactions and sanctions, is that person redeemable? And I think that person is. However, my question to you is, in a time, because you're describing the social context, that if we look at the environment they're coming back to, in a time where unemployment is so high, at a time where the economy is struggling, who gets the opportunities? Where do we say, as policymakers of the future, where do we say we have to decide who is going to be able to have these opportunities? And unfortunately, maybe not through sanctions or through official rulemaking, but fortunately, people through the free market are going to say, these people are convicted of felonies, they serve time, so they're not going to be as qualified as somebody who hasn't. Unfortunately, I feel that everybody should have the chance to be redeemed, but how do we solve that problem when opportunities are so few, and you have people who are going to Wall Street, occupying Wall Street, and some of them haven't even been convicted of felonies or misdemeanors, and they cannot find jobs. So how do we resolve that where those youth have the opportunities, they have the jobs, but as well, the convicts or those who have served time also can have jobs? Thank you.
You're welcome. That's actually a very good question, and it's very relevant. What's happening now is that it's not an either-or kind of proposition. What policymakers in the law enforcement field are doing is they're doing a lot of entrepreneurship training and enabling these individuals to start the kind of businesses that college grads and college-educated individuals typically wouldn't do. So we have landscaping, we have car detailing. There's a guy in Delaware who just started a mobile car detailing unit, and he's actually making a pretty good living doing it. But we have to redefine what is success and what degree of wealth that these individuals can achieve. In terms of saying, from providing these opportunities to these individuals that had never before been in trouble, or not providing this opportunity to these individuals that had never been in trouble, and now let's provide this opportunity for these ex-cons. It's not that black and white. Oftentimes in these kinds of questions, you come across the oxymoronic gray. And so what's occurring is that individuals are being trained more to deal with the kind of economy that we have right now. And that economy is very challenging at best for those of us who are doing very well. And so in that situation, you have individuals that then come in, start their own business, and then create jobs. So that it's the counter. Not only are they not taking and using money from the system, they're actually creating and putting money into the system and creating jobs. So it becomes an economic driver along with a public safety benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Soliman. My question's brief. You said earlier, you gave the example, and that was you, and you had mentioned the statistic about someone in that position, and how likely it would be for someone that was in your position to re-enter prison. You said that the key was education. If you could just give us a kind of a brief explanation of what you were exposed to, if it was education that made you successful, what was it that allowed you to not be part of that statistic, if you will?
It was actually a school teacher, and because I went in at 17, it was actually December of my senior year in high school, and I didn't yet have my high school diploma, and so I went in, and the class I was in was full of older men. I was the youngest everywhere I went, essentially, but I was definitely the youngest in this class. And the teacher took a liking to me, and he said, what is it that you want to do with yourself? What is it that you can do with yourself? And I at 17 years old, was very angry and didn't actually see a future beyond 15 years. You tell me 15 years at 17 years old, that's only 2 years less than I'd been living on this planet. And so I didn't actually, I thought it as a life sentence, to be honest with you. I couldn't really comprehend it. And so I said, I'm just doing time. I'm just here. My parents are pissed off. Everyone's frustrated. I'm just here. And he said, you're not just here, you're living your life. And that was striking in the sense that it then took me to that existential moment in which I had to realize that while I was serving time, that was my state and condition, but I was actually still living my life. And so it was that kind of epiphanal eureka moment, if you will, that motivated me to continue through education. I got my high school diploma that summer, and it was a very significant but very sad moment for me as well, because while I was receiving letters from friends that were now on scholarship at Penn State, and I didn't end up going to Penn State, thank God, but I ended up talking to people that were in prison, that learned a lot while they were in prison, and what I found was individuals that don't have an opportunity while they're in prison to go home, they want to teach people that have that opportunity. And so I gained that knowledge from individuals that were lifers in prison, that were destined to die in prison, that wanted to live vicariously through me when I reemerged. So I got my high school diploma, went on and got my associate's degree, completed with a bachelor's, then I came home and completed my grad degree. And now I'm enrolled at NYU in my doctoral studies.
Thank you, Mr. Soliman, for speaking to us. I just wanted to ask, I think the perception from a lot of society is that a lot of criminals, because they do recidivate, is that a lot of them don't want to be reformed or don't have any desire to rejoin society. Is this true, or is this just a perception that society has that isn't true? And if it is, how can we, how can we change that perception and make society understand that these people do want to be reformed and can be active members of society?
Excellent question. Right now, I'm changing that perception. As we speak, we are all changing that perception. I've never met a drug dealer that wanted to sell drugs. I've met individuals that sold drugs that felt that they had no other option. Individuals that commit crimes do not commit crimes unless they're sociopathic or psychopathic. Individuals that commit crimes typically do so without having seen other options. Again, coming from that nonconformist mentality, individuals that are being raised by individuals that are nonconformist typically do the same thing. So what happens is this: you come home from prison. You're 19 years old, you went to prison for 3 years for trafficking cocaine. 3 years later, you're 22 years old, you're not being able to compete with your average 22-year-old that went through college. And so again, you're going to that job interview. What kind of jobs will a 22-year-old felon get? $7.50 an hour, $8.50 an hour maybe? Living wages. These are not living wages. Do they have benefits? Typically they don't. So what happens is this: most of these individuals have multiple issues, compound diagnoses, whether it's mental health, whether it's substance abuse, or whether it's multiple children. And for a drug charge in certain states, you get a $40,000 fine. And that's levied against your income. Along with the fact that now, if you have a child or 2 or 3, that child support's being pulled out of your paycheck. And so this individual is finding himself working 45, 55, 65 hours a week, and his actual bring home net pay is somewhere in the neighborhood of $88 to $92. That's not even enough for him to pay the bills that he has pre-existing, let alone to continue. What's his option? His only option is to revert to doing what I know best. And that's the problem of recidivism that's so complex, because you have on the one side, from a fiscal perspective, we're saying that this individual has this abstract debt to society we've transformed into a monetary number of $40,000 for every trafficking fine. Well, that individual needs to pay that back. How do they do so if they're not working? And then when they do get a job, they're getting taxed so hard that they can't live, and so they naturally lean towards, let me get a job that won't be taxed. That's the problem that we're trying to fix. Coming up with modifications that are salary appropriate, so that this individual, because what we've found is that yes, while we can't actually extract the amount of money that we'd like to see paid, the amount owed by this individual's behavior, because they have to take responsibility for their own behaviors. While we can't do that, Does it make sense from a financial standpoint to put this individual back in jail if he's not committing crimes, and we end up paying for his incarceration while he's there? So as stewards, from a criminal justice perspective, we're looking at more responsible ways. Can we then, there are a lot of programs nationally right now that are saying, can we then ask these individuals to pay their way back through labor, community service? They go into communities that are really bad and they fix that with actual labor. And while they're working 8 hours a day, fixing this community up, they're working off their fines. Because in that way, they're giving back a tangible reconstruction to that destruction that they'd help perpetuate.
Thank you for your time. I guess this is working. I just have a question about recidivism rates. Not really a question, but a proposal. I'm under the mindset that the current system that we have is broken, that the way in which we treat prisoners, felons, criminals is broken, and the highest recidivism rates are in areas of Europe. I'm pretty sure it's Finland is one of the highest, and their system is radically different from ours. They have much better conditions in prison. Guards normally don't carry weapons, so they're less standoffish to the inmates. The way in which they treat them is completely different. It's not a hierarchy system where you're under me because you're this criminal. And this is an extreme example, but they have a prison on an island. And on this island, the people are almost all self-sufficient. They live in a society, they work a certain amount of hours per day to earn a house, and they each have their own houses. Guards don't even carry weapons. Some don't even wear uniforms. They just walk around. And that is one of the highest recidivism rates of any prison anywhere. And these are also hardened criminals to the point of murderers, serial killers, that are able to come back into society because of how well this prison treated them as human beings, not as cattle or not as second-class citizens.
Okay, so let me ask you a question for clarity. By highest recidivism rate or lowest recidivism rate, are you talking about the Dutch model? Lowest as in least amount of people returning back to prison?
Yes.
Highest as in like people live in these houses and go crazy when they come home?
The least amount of people go back to jail.
Okay. Our recidivism rates nationally are actually dropping, ironically enough. While our prison populations are increasing, our recidivism rates are dropping. Slightly, not enough that it's a satisfactorily positive number there. Typically, the blanket statistic is somewhere around 7 out of 10 that come home, go back to prison. That's unacceptable, obviously, and that's why there's so much focus on the issue. Is our system broken? Let me explain to you from a perspective of having been incarcerated by our system and having been released by our system. Is it broken? No, it's not. I'll tell you why. I personally believe that our justice system is one of the best in the world. Why? Because we have about 11 layers of appeals that individuals can be adjudicated and found to be free after. That's one point that I like to make. Second point is that when in prison, you typically see everyone around you and you identify good people and bad people, because there are good people and bad people here at FDU. There are good people and bad people in prisons. There are good people and bad people everywhere you go. But in prison, the one unique thing that you probably won't find at FDU is individuals that you just would not want to be neighbors with. Really. Just individuals that you know belong in prison, and just you don't want them around your wife, kids, family, mother, grandmother. You just don't want them in society. And so in that regard, prisons are serving their purpose. One, the recidivism rate can be altered specifically with education. And I think that that's where the marriage between prisons, the departments of corrections nationally and collectively, and the departments of education nationally and collectively, I think where that marriage needs to occur is in prisons, so that education is forced upon people. I'm a huge proponent of requiring individuals to receive educational merits before achieving parole. Rather than serving time and completing a program or a diversion or some kind of NA programming that certifies you after X amount of years or X amount of certificate weeks, I'm a proponent of requiring individuals to achieve either a high school diploma, college degree, or some level of job training that'll equip them to be marketable upon release. And then you look at the trades that are more likely to hire felons, are more the labor-based careers. And so we're outsourcing a lot of that nationally into lower rate pay jobs. You know, internationally, we're kind of sending our factories out of our country. And so what's the answer for this? The answer is pretty confounding, and that's what we're working on collectively. But I think recidivism rates in our prisons are interconnected, but not so integrally that that's the main key. When you have individuals that are serving time in prison and then they reemerge, it's what they're doing with their time while they're in prison. Let me be the first to tell you that an individual that's doing the right thing in prison will not be harassed by guards, will not be harassed by police inside the prison. It's the individuals that are doing things, that are persisting to do things wrong, that find themselves in situations that are continuously even more complex. There are prisons within prisons, security housing units, supermaxes, things of that nature, that specifically keep an individual in solitary confinement because that individual has demonstrated that he's a danger to himself or others. So these individuals are being released. What's our responsibility to them? In most cases, the responsibility is the old mentality of trail them, nail them, and jail them. You follow them, you wait for them to commit a crime, and then you put them back in jail. Because that keeps public safety at a pretty good level. But what's happening is you have this counter push of individuals in law enforcement saying, these individuals deserve a chance. Okay, they do, but at what cost to society? There's a balance that has to be struck between the two. There's a middle path that individuals need to find as policymakers and as lawmakers, because it's not okay in our society for you to commit a crime. That's not the message that we're trying to send. But what's the result to stop you from committing another crime? That's the biggest issue.
I have two questions for you. Related. One is, I didn't know you could go to college while you were in jail, so could you kind of explain how that works? And also, do you think that changing some of the current laws, especially around drugs, marijuana, whatnot, do you think that would really alleviate a lot of the problems with the prison population, and then there's less people in prison, there's less people to rehabilitate into society?
Well, one would argue that if you legalize marijuana, then you'll have a much higher rate of drug addiction and substance abuse. That's one argument that I personally believe to be accurate. In that, in Prohibition, alcoholism was not as rampant as it was post. And so in that regard, marijuana typically is an entry-level drug in the rehabilitative community. That's what it's called. So I wouldn't necessarily say that if we were to reduce the crime penalty or even legalize it, would that stop an individual from committing a crime. Individuals that commit crimes typically commit crimes because they feel, and I'm speaking specifically for the individuals that feel like they have no option. I'm not speaking for that individual that does have psychological, sociopathic tendencies. That individual needs to be incarcerated, period. If it's found that this individual is a threat to society, then that individual needs to be in prison. The legalization argument, I typically don't jump into too much because it's not really my specialty. Going to college in prison, my family had the resources to pay for it. And so I was given the opportunity based on my family's resources. We don't qualify for grants or any kind of financial aid when you're incarcerated. Although some unique cases now are providing, some states, not that there's any state with a surplus budget anymore, but some states are providing certain levels of funding because they see the benefits and the connection between recidivism and education. They do see that benefit that this individual, once educated, is a lot less likely to recommit. So some states are making that initiative, pulling dollars out of other areas and finding, like, I think it's Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken, that has a program where they're using seizure money, seizure funds from confiscated goods for education of prisoners that qualify and have demonstrated a likelihood of wanting to proceed in college or higher education. So it's not readily accessible, but the prisons do not prevent you from gaining your education if you have the resources. Mm-hmm.
In an article, we read that a lot of the crimes are committed while the individual is under the influence of substances, and also some of them suffer from addiction. Should it be a goal of incarceration to help alleviate that addiction, and what is the point of incarceration in general?
I think the point of incarceration is, it's the rest stop, if you will. There's a huge emphasis on substance abuse programming, huge emphasis nationally. Every Department of Corrections recognizes the need for having substance abuse programs, therapeutic communities, residential therapeutic communities within the prison framework. And so what is the benefit of prison? The benefit of prison is that while you're there, you have the opportunity for those that want it to gain the kind of rehabilitation and see the kind of professionals that you need to begin the recovery phase from that addiction. I think the statistic is somewhere in the neighborhood of 86% of all new crimes are committed with some link to substances, whether it's the individual that was committing the crime was under a substance abuse addiction, or whether the individual committing the crime was selling a narcotic or involved with a narcotic. I think it's 86%. So that's a very high likelihood that anyone that commits a crime has some kind of encounter or dependence on a substance. The actual purpose, the philosophical purpose of prisons, I think everybody individually walks away with their own understanding depending on the vantage point in which you look at the diamond or the hole. But the reality of the situation is that in every society, dating back to antiquity, there was always a consequence for a negative behavior. And that consequence could have been hanging. And I venture to say that our prison system is more humane than hanging. But at the same time, it's the balance that needs to be struck. Because we as a society, in our civilization, we have guidelines to dictate that if you do this, then you receive this. And that's a good framework to keep everyone safe so that we all have that self-accountability. And I think prisons are a necessary consequence of that accountability.
That's all the time we have. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.